and this part is titled The Case of Iceland. We have 3 speakers in this session. Each one of them will have 15 minutes to present their talk, and I will only allocate time at the end of the session for questions, and then the questions will be put forth to all of them at the same time. The order of the day is, first I invite Baldur Þórhallsson. He is a Demone Chair of European Studies and a Research Director for the Center of Small State Studies at the University of Iceland. And Þórhallsson, or Baldur as we most commonly call everybody in Iceland by the first name, he has published widely on the topic of small states, on European integration, on Iceland's domestic and foreign policy. He has published 2 books on the issue of today's talks, but today he will be talking, or the title of his lecture is The Effectiveness and Failure of the Small Public Administration in Iceland relating to the 2008 economic crisis. Please, Baldur, the floor is yours.
Chair Hólmfríður and distinguished guests, first of all, I would like to thank for the opportunity to speak about my 2 favorite subjects, Iceland and small states. I'm not an expert in the field of public administration, but I've written a few papers on small states, mainly focusing on small states within the European Union. But now, today, I'm going to try to link these 2 subjects, if I can say so. And the aim of the talk is to discuss whether a small state like Iceland encounters poorly or partly structural problems associated with its smallness in the international system. I think it is important to examine the role of public administrations in the new globalized world and the pros and cons of their engagement with regional and international organizations. So let's consider 3 key questions. First, does Iceland's small size in terms of its economy and bureaucracy provide a better understanding of the economic collapse and its responses to the crisis than do factors regarding economic management and administrative competence? Second, how can a small public administration cope with increased demands posed by domestic and international actors? And thirdly, are small states more or less in a need of an external shelter, an alliance, in order to cope with the new globalized economy? The original focal points in the small states literature were variables associated with states' capabilities in terms of number of inhabitants, the size of the economy, military strength, and territorial size. The influence of having a small central bureaucracy and small diplomatic corps was also mentioned early in the development of the literature, though it was never properly dealt with or taken fully into account. Small states were said to be more economically vulnerable due to the small size of their gross domestic product, their small domestic markets, reliance on external trade, and exposure to international economic fluctuations. Small entities were even regarded as not being economically sustainable or viable. It is obvious that the small size of public administrations poses constraints on small states' internal and external activities. In the 60s, at the height of the decolonization process, doubt was even cast on small states' ability to govern themselves. It was argued that they had less capacity for exposure to risk due to the small size of their bureaucracy and less margin for error. They were said to rely on the larger neighbors for basic survival and an engagement with the outside world. And alliance formation was said to be must for their success. Later, in and after the mid-80s, small states began to be seen as economically and administratively smart, salient, resilient, and faster and more fit to adjust to global competition and other challenges. There was a fundamental shift in the literature in the mid-80s. They were no longer seen as being constrained by their small administration and the smallness of their economy. Instead, the informality and flexibility of the bureaucracy and the small domestic market were seen as providing them with opportunities domestically and internationally. It was all about opportunities. On the other hand, the question which remains unanswered is whether good economic management and administrative competence are more relevant than the opportunities and constraints associated with smallness. So let's now look at our case, or the role of the public administration in our case, Iceland and the economic collapse in 2008. Iceland's small administration did not have the resources needed to engage fully in the comprehensive policy making and legislation concerning the financial sector. The size of staff and lack of expertise within the administration led to a fundamental lack of supervision of the financial sector and assessment of the risk entailed in the expansion for the small community. The small bureaucracy was unable to deal properly with the complexity of the massive expansion by the banks. Their operations in the new globalized international economy were simply too demanding. That said, governments could have prioritized the building of a coherent and competent administration. They did not do so, and the small administration was given insufficient resources to deal with the demanding task of supervising the financial sector. The government's firm belief in the free market and limited interference in its operations, including those of the banks, was manifested in politicians' official and unofficial pressure not to restain the so-called outvasion. A small administration cannot be expected to engage in policy formation in as decisive manner as larger administrations. Icelandic policymakers did not take account of the fact and that the scope of the Icelandic administration will always be more limited than that of most other administrations in Europe. This does not mean that nothing can be done to build up a coherent and competent public administration in small states. And as we've seen from the lectures today, there are different ways around this. Caroline mentioned how the Danes work in Brussels to enhance their influence. Christian mentioned an interesting case of Liechtenstein, how Liechtenstein has found a way to cope with the burden of implementing the EEA laws. And it has been interesting to follow the case of Malta in the last 10 years, and as Roderick mentioned, and how the Maltese administration has been transformed in order to cope with the complexity of the EU. And I'm basically going to leave it up to the experts in the field of public administration to explain how to build the administration domestically to cope with all this complexity. What I would like to mention is how I think small states can look outside their borders for administrative shelter in order to build competence. For instance, we can compensate for the smallness of the public administration by seeking advice and assistance from other states and close engagement with supervisory bodies such as the EFTA Surveillance Authority, ESA, and its sister organization, the European Commission. Instead of expressing annoyance over alleged interference by the EFTA Surveillance Authority, Icelandic politicians and public bodies should welcome its efforts of supervision. Moreover, the absence of Icelandic politicians from the EEA, or the EU decision-making processes concerning financial rules, left them unaware of the implications for the small economy and the capacity of the small state entity. Small actors need to be fully aware of their external surroundings and the opportunities and challenges posed by their international environment. We need awareness and we need a decisive public administration to deal with these opportunities and challenges. And I would like to go as far as stating that a doubt has to be cast on the ability of a small public administration to stand on its own in the new globalized economy without an external administrative assistance. In addition, in the case of Iceland, traditional features of the Icelandic administration, which Professor Gunnar Helgi Kristinsson has identified and written a lot about, such as little emphasis on long-term policy making, a general lack of professionalism, outsourcing of projects, and political interference, led to insufficiency about the threat posed by the so-called outvasion for the state and society. And of course, it is not all about smallness or the size of the public administration, as was clear from Per lectures. It can, for example, be about trust, to mention a variable which is or seems to be important. That all said, we need to consider the original small state literature regarding the small size of the public administration and the economy in order to understand fully the reasons behind the Icelandic economic meltdown. The small domestic market, the small state's budget, and the small national currency could not sustain the Iceland outvasion. The financial sector outgrew the domestic market's ability to fend it. Icelandic authorities did not have any external backup such as they had enjoyed from the United States during the Cold War and previously under the Danish umbrella. Economic size did not pose any constraints during the economic boom up until 2008. However, size constraints gradually emerged as the warning signals about the state's capacity to stand by its banks started to pile up. The fall in the exchange rate and later the currency shortage further weakened the system. Iceland was on its own in responding to the crisis event, and in the midst of the crisis, it was faced with Britain's closure of an overseas branch of its only functioning bank. Moreover, the country had great difficulties in obtaining IMF assistance. So, one of the most important lessons to be learned from the crash is the restricted scope of the small economies to engage in international global economy without a proper buffer. We are back to established observation in the small state literature that a small state needs shelter in order to limit the risk exposure involved in engagement with the international community. And now to the concluding part. As we've seen from previous lectures, small states can overcome many of the obstacles associated with the small size of their small administration and their small economy. First, we need a public acknowledgement of inbuilt weaknesses. Small states need to acknowledge the limitations and take notice of it in their economic planning and structuring of their public administration. Icelandic policymakers did not acknowledge the limited capacity of the public administration and the inbuilt vulnerability of the small domestic market. Second, we need sound economic management and administrative competence. Third, constraints imposed by having limited personnel and small domestic markets may be compensated for by closer engagement with relevant regional and international organizations, as I mentioned earlier. Seeking advice and assistance from others can compensate for limited domestic administrative competence. Instead of expressing annoyance over alleged interference by organizations such as the IMF, small states should welcome their effort at supervision. These may provide an important administrative shelter. Having resources to protect may ease economic burdens and provide political, diplomatic, and administrative assistance in times of need. Thank you.
Thank you, Baldur, for your interesting lecture. Our next speaker is Gunnar Helgi Kristinsson. He is a professor of public administration at the Faculty of Political Science here at the University of Iceland. And Gunnar Helgi has participated actively in public debates in Iceland. He has published on themes related to local politics, election, political parties, local democracy, coalitions, the parliament, quite a wide range of affairs. Today, his lecture is titled Public Administration, Reforms Following the Crash. Gunnar Helgi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The crash in 2008 opened up a reform agenda in Icelandic administration and politics more generally that's on a magnitude that's seldom seen in stable democracies. And it was moreover, it was almost totally unprepared because the crash was unexpected and the capacity to respond to it was very limited, and the system had no experience of dealing with similar types of crises. So, following the crash, there opened up a very chaotic agenda, a very chaotic period in many ways in Icelandic politics, which produced contradictory policies and contradictory priorities in many ways. During the first few months after the crash, we saw a period of classic blame avoidance strategies where the power holders basically said, there's no one to blame, let's not make this personal. They said, well, there are theories about why this happened, why don't we look into the matter? And the classical tool of blame avoidance strategies, of course, is a truth commission, and that's what was established in December 2008. The Special Investigation Commission, which was the first main step towards dealing with settling the accounts of the crisis. Then, when nothing else happened, there followed the pots and pans revolution with the change of government on the 1st of February in 2009. The demand for a new election, which took place in April 2009, and the demand for a constitutional assembly, which eventually provided a draft constitution which, although that wasn't accepted in the end, but it still remains on the agenda. Then the new Málþingið that was elected in 2009 sat down a special committee to deal with the crisis, how to settle the account, which actually in the end called for the gathering of the Court of Impeachment for the first time in Icelandic history, and came to the conclusion that part of dealing with the crisis and settling the accounts would have to be making the Málþingið more powerful in Icelandic politics. That was part of their response. Then we had, of course, the judicial part of the settling of the accounts through the Court of Impeachment and various other ways, the establishment of a special prosecutor's office and a tremendous amount of court cases that have cost a lot of money and taken a lot of time, a process that's still in progress. Now, finally, there were two committees that were put up to deal with and suggest changes and improvements of the administration in response to the report of the Special Investigation Commission that I mentioned earlier. Two committees. One was the working group established in 2009, appointed by the Prime Minister to suggest ways of how the ministries should respond to this report of the Special Investigation Commission. And parallel to that, there was the Committee on the Revision of the Ministry Act, which originally was accepted by Parliament in 1969, taking into account the conclusions of the working group. Now, paradoxically, the reform of the executive received by far the least attention of these different reform measures. And I say paradoxically because, well, there are several reasons why I say paradoxically. In the first place, Iceland has a parliamentary system of government. And like other parliamentary systems of government, the executive plays a key role in policy making and policy implementation. So if something went wrong that had to do with the public sector in Iceland or in fact the government, you should look into what happened in the executive and in the public sector. But that was very low on the order of priorities. The idea that a natural response to the crisis was to improve the policy-making powers of Parliament was a very strange idea, because the Icelandic Parliament was, before the crisis, one of the most powerful parliaments in any parliamentary system. So if strengthening the Alþingi, the Icelandic Parliament, was the cure, what was then the disease? Which is a strange way. It was a strange way of approaching things. Now, the demand for improving or revising the Constitution was also a very strange idea, because no convincing account of the crisis places the Icelandic Constitution at the center of the event. I mean, there's no way that you can take this old Danish Constitution and make it responsible for the crash in Iceland. It's not likely. Then the excessive preoccupation with the legal aspects of the whole affair, well, it's proven extremely time-consuming, very costly. It may call for a revision of the organization of the Icelandic courts, and it has actually, after 6 years, done nothing to improve the legitimacy of the Icelandic system, so far as we can see, because public confidence remains very low. Nonetheless, I think the two committees, which admittedly were focused very much on the top of the executive, the ministries, they did some interesting work. Well, I have to say that I was member of both of them. And what I want to do is, although I can't say that I can present here any official version of what happened there, I want to share with you some of the sort of the thoughts that were going around and the ideas that developed in the two committees. I was chairman of the working group, and I was the only person that was member of both committees. Now, our starting point was the small capacity of the administration, which is a feature, of course, shared by many small systems. The problem, of course, when we speak about capacity is what do we mean by capacity? It's not easy. I've tried this in my research on local government, trying to find indicators of different administrative capacity at the local level. And if they have a lot of people working there and they spend a lot of money, that's not necessarily capacity. That may simply be waste. If they produce very good results, very good outcomes, well, that may simply be because they have rich societies, lots of human capital, social capital, and so on. It may not have anything to do with the actual output or what the public administration does. So it's a difficult problem. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to use Francis Fukuyama's recent article in Governance, where he asks the question, what constitutes high-quality government? And he says there are two things. In the first place, capacity. That means in the context of his articles, access to resources, and secondly, access to a professional, merit-based bureaucracy. And the second thing that you need is autonomy, or rather the appropriate degree of administrative autonomy, where politicians and administrators form a balance, where politicians respect the professional know-how of the administrators, and the administrators, they are not too subordinate towards the political authority. I think these are sensible indicators of what might be termed high-quality government. I think we might want to add the third one, which is organizational coordination, because we could have the other things, but if they're not properly coordinated, they're not likely to function in a proper manner. So high-quality government would mean sufficient resources, a professional bureaucracy, an adequate degree of bureaucratic autonomy, and organizational coordination. So, how does the Icelandic administration measure up to these criteria according to the reports of the committees that I mentioned earlier? Well, the short answer is not very well, but there are nuances to this short answers that are important. In the first place, we should look at the resources. Obviously, the resources of the Icelandic administration are very, very limited, very little in international comparisons, but they're partly very little because the attention to the problems of smallness has been too small. In a society of 320,000 inhabitants, the number of ministries in 2010 was 12. It had been up to 14 previously. The total number of employees in the ministries was almost 600. The average size of a ministry was 50, ranging from 23 to 94. And in terms of the percentage of the state administration, 3% of the manpower was employed in the ministries. A very small part of the administration was placed in the ministries. At the same time, we had a very fragmented structure of agencies with 193 agencies employing 21,000 employees, with an average size of 109 employees, ranging from one in several cases to won the National Hospital with 4,600 employees. That's 97% of the number of state employees. The same, you get the same picture at the local level, that the Icelandic local governments, they are between 70 and 80, and we have the smallest local governments in Europe. I think even, including Spain. I'm not sure though, I haven't looked at that recently. So that was a problem. Resources was a problem. Now, professional bureaucracy, I should say the professionalism in the administration on the whole has improved a lot over time. And in the ministries, for example, 80% of the employees are university educated, mostly very dedicated people who work long hours for small compensation. However, the attention to human resource management at the ministry level has been very little, and the turnover rate of employees is extremely high. Only 50% of the employees had worked there for 5 years or longer. And only 20% had worked there for 15 years. So the priority given by governments to the ministries has been low, which is reflected, among other things, in lower salaries than in the other Nordic countries, longer working hours, shorter vacations, and so on. Now, administrative autonomy is generally small. Now, I know that Per Leikert was just presenting data that I've been part of collecting, the COCOP's data, but the structure of that data is different from the conclusions that I'm presenting here. It's collected from the agencies, and it's well known that the ministerial reach to political appointments stops with the head of the agencies, because the heads of agencies primarily, they employ lower personnel in the public administration. But there is a long tradition in Iceland of political patronage, and that has undermined the administrative autonomy of the administration and placed generally the administration in a very subservient position vis-a-vis the politicians. Although you could say in some cases autonomy at the agency level is considerable. You could even say that it's not really autonomy, it's negligence, because the access by or the connections between the ministries and the agencies is very weakly developed, and basically the agency heads, they're not very happy with their contacts with the ministries. Now, organizational coordination, we have had a very segmented administration with many ministries, which are difficult to coordinate, with a very large degree of ministerial autonomy, far greater than even in the Nordic countries, with very small ministries, which in some cases are easily overshadowed by strong interest groups, with strong agentification, where the agencies are extremely independent in many ways, and they're very much separated from the ministerial level, and this lack of contact and control, with extremely many agencies and small agencies, and a very fragmented local level. So organizational coordination is inevitably extremely difficult in a system like this. It's a difficult system to govern, and in the report of the Special Investigation Commission, you get a lot of examples of these problems. Now, administrative reform since the 1980s there have been two main currents. One is the Rechtsstaat current, emphasizing bureaucratic process, and one is the managerialist current, which has emphasized new public management techniques. Neither of these have really addressed the key problems of the Icelandic administration that I've just been discussing. So the recommendations of the administrative reform reports that I've been discussing are, in the first place, to do with resources. What we need is larger units to some extent, although this simply creating larger units is not always sufficient and not always appropriate, because just merging units doesn't really, produce economies of scale and synergies and so on in every case. So that has to be looked into carefully. We also suggested creating greater flexibility, both horizontally between the employment in the ministries and in the agencies, and vertically, vertically between the ministries and the agencies, and horizontally between the ministries. We suggested a system of incentives for the agencies, for the ministries, and for the employees to make administrative careers more flexible and more dispersed, actually. So as you could say this was like creating a greater degree of networkedness within the administration to help it function in a coordinated manner. We pointed out the need for better professional bureaucracy, pointing out, for example, the problems of the ministries. We pointed out the need for greater administrative autonomy, for example, in the way personnel is hired, and we suggested several ways of improving the coordination of the system, apart from creating larger units and merging ministries. This included strengthening hierarchy at the political level, which was extremely fragmented with ministerial autonomy, small role of the prime minister, small role of the cabinet, and so on, and generally making the different work categories in the ministries work more together. So our recommendations were more in line with the joined up government type of thinking than in the new public management type of thinking. We also paid attention to the smallness issue, and we recommended that smallness should be taken seriously as a task, and the Icelandic administration has to learn more about how to function effectively as a small system, which really hasn't devoted all that much attention to. So this was 4 years ago. In retrospect, there may be reason to ask, was this very successful? Per Lagrid's data seem to indicate that administrators are not very happy. Well, maybe they wouldn't be in a time of extremely drastic cuts in the public sector in any case. You're never happy if you have to make cuts. There are several considerations here. One is that maybe this wasn't the right time to make a large amount of administrative change. The whole system was under extreme pressure, and it took a lot of energy from the system making this kind of change. So you could say that, but at the same time you could say windows of opportunities, they open very rarely. So if you want to make change, you simply have to use the windows of opportunity that you get. So I'm leaving you with that thought. I would have liked a greater emphasis on bureaucratic autonomy and greater emphasis on the policy role of the administration. I have some doubts about what was done to strengthen the access of ministers to political assistance, which have been increased, and it was recommended in our reports. Maybe the effects of the whole reform affair would have been greater if the opposition at the time would have been involved to a greater extent, because what I fear is that some of the reform will simply be rolled back with a new government when the opposition of that day is now the present government, and they may not feel committed to the reform at all. So, but in any case, what I think we need is a proper evaluation of what the effects were, so that we can learn from what went wrong and what went right. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Gunnar Helgi. And our last speaker in this session is Sigurbjörg Sigurgeirsdóttir. She is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Political Science here at the University of Iceland. And she is an active and opinionated blogger on government and political affairs. She publishes on policy processes and policy making, constitutional matters, political system, transparency, and today her title is A Small State, So What? A special mechanism approach to the understanding of small state policy and governance. So, Sigurbjörg, the floor is yours, please.
Cheers, Hólmfríður and dear guests. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about small state governance and policies. I have to say that it's not actually my subject, but public administration and policy is my subject. But I have to explain why this title, because when I did my PhD at London School of Economics, I was drifted towards understanding better the processes and mechanisms which I encountered when I was collecting data to understand the processes leading up to the mega merger of 3 big hospitals here in Reykjavik and in London. And I saw immediately some differences, and I became interested in, well, does size matter? And I kept talking about this with my supervisors, both coming from the big countries, from the big academic community, and they kept saying, Silla, come on, it's small, anyway, so what? You may find that it matters, but what can you do about it? Got nothing to do about it. So again and again, I had to brush this thinking away. Okay, it's small, so what? Just continue with your research and come to that conclusion. So that's why this title. But what I like to explain where I come from then is that I'm concerned with the public administration here in Iceland, given the fact that we've established institutional framework more or less based on ideas from the US and the UK, the big systems. And for instance, if you look at the financial sector in Iceland, it's almost, the institutional framework is almost a replica of what we see in the UK. So that's why when I came back to Iceland, became interested in trying to understand how we could possibly better understand the nature of the problems that our small state governance encounters when they are trying to practice within a similar institutional framework with the same requirement of independence and formalities as in the bigger systems. And the reason I want to understand this better is to sort of find, or I believe that better understanding of this could provide us with some tools and responses to the problems, and then to design better institutions. So what I'm going to say here basically is this. I'm going to account for some of the characteristics of small state administration and policies, and sort of trying to pull out what it actually is entailing, what is it telling us. Secondly, I'm going to explain my explanatory approach, in which I'm trying to get my head around what is actually happening in the financial sector. By the way, I'm not from finance. My background is in social sciences and in social work and then social policy. So I'm sort of person outside the system trying to get my head around it, and I'm using ideas. I'm very fond of ideas and theory, so that's my basic tools. So what I'm going to do here, I will make some observations of the policy debate in Iceland in and around the crash in 2008. And then some theoretical conceptualization of the supporting evidence. So I will begin by, do I use this one here? Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Okay. This is, does it work?
No, we'll use this one.
Okay, great.
It works?
Okay, does it
Okay.
work? Great. So what I've put up on here is the first slide. Here I just put up on the slide some of the characteristics that this author found in research in Estonia. And I'm not going to go into details of this. It's just something that I bring up here. These are the characteristics, and what are they saying? What kind of impression will I get about what is happening in small states? What kind of processes these various characteristics may entail? There is also older literature about these various characteristics of small states. But what I wanted to say about the former one then is that this author, in the discussion, the paper mentions further implications for research and comes to say that these five traits of the smaller state all point towards bounded rationality, and that the probability is more that this policy making in these states and decision making will be more characterized by logic of appropriateness, and that is the sort of, that will have a bigger sort of explanatory power than, for instance, than the logic of consequences. So therefore, in analyzing public administration and public policy making in small state administration, due respect should be given to values, informal structures, and personalities. Here are the other kind of characteristics from the older, earlier research. But in understanding these characteristics of small state administration and what they entail by means of processes and group dynamics, I myself have turned to social and psychological and behavioral science for concepts and theories to dig into the observations I make when I look into public administration systems. That's why I find mechanism-based explanations quite helpful, mechanism-based explanation as opposed to covering law or statistical explanations. So the mechanism-based explanation as defined by Hedstrom and Sverberg is a social mechanism. A social mechanism is a precise, abstract, and action-based explanation which shows how the occurrence of a triggering event regularly generates the type of outcome to be explained. And given the small policy context, I believe that processes and mechanisms occur with more rapid pace in smaller societies, have potentially more sweeping impact, and are more easily detectable. The key analytic exercise in mechanism-based explanation is to specify the mechanisms that have brought the relationship between the observable entities into existence and explain how their mechanisms operate, and thus how the social phenomena are brought about. When I'm talking about policy, I refer to the broader policy arena which involve the greater policy-making community. I'm referring to the public, the media, impact of media, politics, the bureaucracy, and the wider policy community of interest and expertise. This is to say the focus is not just on the administration and how decisions are prepared in the offices of government. So let's have a look at typical mechanisms, which are quite famous and very well known. The so-called belief formation mechanisms, as they have conceptualized these three types of mechanisms, Hedstrom and Sverberg. The self-fulfilling prophecy is typical for a process which has been explained in A Run on Bank, which is a famous study by Merton. We have a very interesting line in a poetry in Iceland that when I talk about this with my students, I use that to explain this mechanism. And I like to tell you what the line is. It's a line from a poem written by an Icelandic poet who emigrated, by the way, and moved to Canada and lived near the Rocky Mountain. And the line goes in Icelandic like this: Þegar alþjóð einu spáir ómláns rætist það. To translate it into English, when a whole of a nation predicts misfortune, it comes through. So this is that kind of a mechanism, self-fulfilling prophecy. Network diffusion processes, this is a very common in studying like behavior in a group of people. Very famous, this and repeated study on behavioral, prescription behavioral of physician, and the threshold theory of collective behavior, this bandwagon effect and tipping. Some people have pointed towards the Arabic Spring and referring to or explaining that in terms of a tipping point or a bandwagon effect. Other well-known mechanisms are in the work of Albert Hersman, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, micro-motives and micro-behavior, and the famous study of Schiller during the dot-com crash, irrational exuberance. I kind of like very much also the term from James Marsh, success-induced bias, meaning that the more often you experience successes in your business or in your practices, you start to believe that you can't fail. Nothing can go wrong. And we could actually see part of that in the run-up to the crisis in Iceland. What the mechanisms that I have been focusing on and sort of fiddling with and trying to get my head around what actually happened here in the run-up to the crisis are mechanisms that I've sought to Baumgartner and Jones and are published in their book from 2002 on policy dynamics. And to begin with explaining these mechanisms, the positive feedback mechanism is a reinforcing mechanism. And that is everyone is sort of happy, clappy, and everything is going fine. And nobody is criticizing that. And the negative feedback mechanism is kind of a controlling mechanism, correcting possibly a spin or that things are spinning out of control. And the authors, they like it they compare it with a heating system. And when the temperature is going up, you have a valve on the heating system that cuts off the heat to avoid overheating. So the interaction between these mechanisms, they work like that. That in the absence of negative feedback mechanism, positive feedback mechanisms can actually spin things out of control. And you have a herding behavior. Everything start to believe that, yes, our Vikings, they've discovered the new model. This is from policy studies in political science. And these ideas have their counterparts, but more instrumental counterparts in finance and economics, with reference to the terms pro-cyclicality and counter-cyclicality. Typical kind of mechanism in political science would be a very effective and critical analysis coming out from the academia as a negative feedback mechanism, good and well working and operating media, creating this kind of self-correcting mechanism in the system. In the finance and economics, the instruments we see there are like taxation, fiscal policy, taxation, interest rates, capital ratio, equity ratio. So these are quite instrumental. And the same interaction between these two terms is that in the counter-cyclical policy works against economic and financial fluctuation, whereas pro-cyclical policy magnifies them. So you see, we have similar ideas, but termed in a different realm of, or different disciplines. So these are the ideas I've been working on and trying to sort of cross these boundaries of discipline in order to understand how things operate in the financial system. Let's then remember that in the run-up to the crash in Iceland, it has been very much discussed, this situation of herding and, and that one of the reports that came out in 2006, and we had experts writing a report on stability in Iceland, and they published a report on financial stability in Iceland. And then we have to bear in mind, when foreigners come and see our system, and they can see that the institutions are there, and they say, okay, you got all the institutions in place, so the system must be fine. But what they don't realize, and something that they may miss, is maybe part of the smallness. It is the connections between people, the personality, the nepotism, the cronyism, and the way appointment system has been working in Icelandic administration. After this report, one of the authors actually said, we were told that there were good institutions, and we just went with that information. Other experts came and did a report on one of the banks in early 2008. They simply said, look, this business model of this bank was never viable. And one of these authors, he actually said, in a speech he gave here in Iceland in 2011, this was collective madness, not a perfect storm. For a decade or a half, leading up to 2008, Iceland is an example of collective madness. The banks were a big part of it. They led the dance. So we are, what we see in this statement is there are lots of mechanisms there, processes. My final, I've got a warning here, so I'm stressed. I'm going to bring out now the final slide, where I am going to take the Financial Supervisory Authority in Iceland, which we use FME as an abbreviation, and explain some of the problems FME has encountered in its very short life. It was established in 1999. And we could conceive of the Financial Supervisory Authority as one of the mechanisms put in place to control the system, to put in place rules on equity ratio and so forth. This agency has gone through various hurdles over the years. And by the way, this agency, at its very inception, the CEO who was hired through this agency was a son of a minister of housing, and he was appointed by the party brother of his father, a minister of commerce. Just a year after that particular minister of commerce appointed the son of the minister of social affairs and housing as the CEO of this agency, he left politics and went into the central bank as the governor of the central bank. So you had suddenly a network of people who knew each other, who had a favor to repay, and so forth. And these are the things that foreigners may not spot or detect when they are looking at the Icelandic system. So I'm going to mention here 3 processes by which the mechanism of financial supervisory authorities were weakened in the run-up to the crisis. Well, maybe not in the run-up to the crisis. 2 of these processes occurred in the run-up to the crisis, and a third happened after the crisis, and that's very interesting. This process of emasculating, it has to do with the staffing. And you have the figure there, I don't have to explain this, and this shows how weak actually this agency was in relation to the banking sector it was supposed to supervise. The second process is the process by which agency experience regulatory capture. We have a lot about that, the regulatory capture thing in the SIG report, but what I want to draw your attention to is a concept that was coined by Willem Bouter, and it's the cognitive regulatory capture. And I think, of course, yes, we have regulatory capture in all systems, big and small. But I do think, even in bigger societies, bigger systems where you have the relatively small elite, this happens, cognitive regulatory capture, like in the Fed in the US. But if we have those problems there, we may have them in a more intensified version here in Iceland. Cognitive regulatory capture explains how the actors, the people who are regulating, the inspectors and those who are being inspected, are actually drawn from a very narrow pool of people from the same school. They are living with a very similar living standard. They are even maybe member of the same golf club, and they are attending the same restaurants, and they begin to share the view and the problems of the people they are supposed to regulate. So this is the type of capture that I think is quite relevant to the Icelandic situation. Finally, we have the discrediting process, undermining the credibility of an agency or its senior staff. And this is a process that was triggered with the publication of the SIG report in 2010, after appointing a new CEO after the crash. Information came out in that report that triggered or made this agency vulnerable to discrediting campaign by vested interests. And that had a very dramatic ending. By the way, the last process, I can very easily detect what triggered that one. But the 2 other ones is not as clear, because you can, yes, identify the bigger event of privatizing the banks and the banks rushing off in competition to get the most favorable status of becoming too big to fail, and thus generating moral hazard. So, okay, this is what I wanted to share with you about what I am concerned when I'm looking into the public administration in Iceland. Of course, what we see problems which we encounter in big systems, but I'm trying to understand how we could possibly understand them better in small systems in order to address them properly. Thank you.